In this video, we're going to unpack the story of Abraham. Where was he born? Who was his father? What's the backstory? How did he become the person who God decides to come to him in a vision and tell him, Abraham, leave your city, leave your birthplace, go to the land I'll show you. Why Abraham? Why was he different? Why not Noah? Noah seemed to be a tzaddik. He was a righteous person. So why didn't God test Noah? Why does he test Abraham? And furthermore, Abraham seems cryptic because all it says in Genesis 11 is that there's a man named Terach and he gives birth to three children. One of them is Abraham, and Haran has a child Lot and has a daughter named Sarah, and Haran dies, and they're on their way to Eretz Canaan, and suddenly God appears to Abraham and says, go to Canaan. So what's going on? So let's dive in. So chapters 12 and onwards in Genesis get really exciting because we begin what seems to be a story, the story of Abraham, his birth, his journey, his travels to Egypt, and nonstop stories with Sarah and wars and captives, and then the birth of Isaac, and then there's just story after story. And we begin to believe that God is giving us a story. He's telling us things for us to learn messages from. But our sages teach us that there's something far greater going on here. You see, first off, Moses wrote the story of Genesis, and he wrote it when at the end of his life in the book of Deuteronomy. And this is to show us that this is not just stories teaching us ideas. It's actually the way God wants us to understand the formation of the Jewish people. And I'll explain. You see, we start with the creation of the world, and the world was created in stages. These stages, the Mishnah says, were 10 stages. Asar ma'amaris nivra olam. And each one of these stages was to teach us that this world is important to God. God could have easily made it in one go, but he wanted something to happen. He wanted it to be a process. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when writing the Mishnah, explains that not only was creation in 10 stages, but also there were 10 generations from Abraham to Noah, and there were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And why was there 10 generations before Noah? Well, it was to teach us that God is slow to anger, erech apayim. And therefore, God allowed each generation to fall and to get lower and lower, and God did not intervene for the entire generation of Noah until what was called the May Noach, the waters of Noah. Noah did not intervene as well. Noah did not do what Abraham did. The Zohar says clearly that Noach did not follow through and try to correct the world. He did not try to change the people around him. And the Mishnah says that they continued to do bad throughout the first 10 generations. There was constantly a progressive degradation of all the world until the waters came, and that is to teach us that God is slow to anger. So from Noah until Abraham, there's also 10 generations. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi writes in the Mishnah that the reason why there are 10 generations is also to teach us that God is slow to anger. But he says there's a difference between the slow to anger that happened before Noah, because that anger that God held back finally came out in a mabul, a flood that killed all of humanity except for Noah in his teva. And Noah was saved. So once we have that idea that God is slow to anger, what furthermore can we learn about God being slow to anger? We get it. God is willing to not intervene. He's willing to allow the world to fall apart. And King Solomon wrote, Tov kas mitzchok. It's better that God shows anger and not allow people to just do whatever they want. It's best if God intervenes, and God does intervene today. But at the time of Noah, God started the world and said, I'm going to do an experiment. Now, we don't understand God's ways, but I'm going to show in this video how this wasn't really an experiment. This was a necessary process of us extracting good from bad. You see, Terach was Abraham's father, and Terach was an idol worshiper, and Abraham came from an idol worshiper. And more than that, Abraham, the Medrash says, only found God at age 48. Yes, there are opinions that he found God at 3, but the opinion of the Medrash is that at age 48, he finally decided that God exists. And I'll explain. Let's get back to Noah. Noah comes out of the ark, and the world begins to go backwards. And God, once again, even though he's promised, I'm not going to destroy the world again, but he allows once again the world, Hayumachisim ubayim, the Mishnah in Parakeh, Mishnah Gimel says, the Mishnah in Avos says, that they continue to do bad to teach us that God is erech hapayim, God is slow to anger. So I asked the question, how much more could God be slow to anger? What he had already proven with the generation of Noah. He'd already proven that he's willing to allow the whole world to fall apart. And after the flood, he said, I'm not going to do this anymore. So what exactly is God doing from the generation of Noah until Abraham? Why is he letting it fall apart? Why didn't he just bring Moses straight away, give them the Torah, and say, that's it, follow the Torah? Why do we need to have this process? What's the deeper meaning over here? So the Mishnah says that from Noah until Abraham, there's also 10 generations. And these 10 generations is to teach us that God is slow to anger until Abraham comes and gets the reward for everything. The Ma'am Lo'ez, Reb Yitzchak Al-Gassi, who wrote this in 1723, writes a brilliant understanding of what was going on over here. That, yes, God was slow to anger until Noah. But once God showed the world that the world could be destroyed with a flood, people should have taken heed. Once we've witnessed this terrible destruction, it's a different world. And suddenly, the people who were angering God, who were immoral and following idols, bowing down to idols, and believing in duality of God, of believing of a God who does good and a God who does bad, and a God who could behave and could be embodied inside of wood and stone or anything. Was God quiet? Yeah, of course he was quiet. But God was still showing that his slow to anger was much more intense because the people were sinning much more. So he's slow to anger this whole time. That why does the Mishnah say that Abraham takes reward for everybody? Does that mean all the way back to Noah? Or does it mean all the way back to Adam? Says the Ma'am Lo'ez, Reb Yitzchak Al-Gazi, he says that that Abraham gets reward for all the generations until his time. Why? I'll explain. You see, in order to get to an Abraham, we need to have a Terach. We need to have a person who's an idol worshiper. That's the backdrop. That's how the story unfolds. That good comes from bad. We find this in countless stories, but I'll just give the classic story that's coming up, the story of Sodom, where Abraham goes into Sodom and he pulls out Lot. Why does he pull out Lot? Who comes from Lot? Moab. Who comes from Moab? King David. Who comes from King David? Messiah. Only Abraham can go into Sodom and pull out Messiah. The message over here is something astounding. And it's not just a message. You see, the stories, quote unquote, in Bereshis are not just messages, they're realities. In fact, the war, for instance, that Abraham did with the 4 kings is the war that the Jews had with the 4 kingdoms. throughout the generations. And all the things that happened to our fathers will happen to us. It's a rule. It's a fact of life built into creation. So when Abraham is born out of Terach, like it says that Abraham is born from Terach, he comes out of Terach, it's teaching us that from Terach, who was the culmination of all the bad from Noach, came Avram. And don't forget that since the sin of Adam and Eve, all good is hidden in bad. Our job is to take the good out of the bad. Interestingly, one of the little known laws about keeping Shabbat is that we cannot take the bad from the good. If we're eating fish, we can't take the bone out of the food, but we can take the fish away from the bone. We could take the good out of the bad. So the first lesson that we're going to learn from this story is the ability to take good out of bad. And not only that, it has to come from the bad. And Terach was an idol worshiper, and it's pretty cryptic about how Abraham came to be the person that God reveals himself to and tells him to leave his land. So let's go back to some of the original questions we asked, and we're going to also ask some new questions. We asked, first of all, Abraham in Genesis 12, God reveals himself to him and tells him, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your land, miladucha, from your place of birth, mibeis avicha, from your father's house, el aretz asher areka, to the land I'm going to show you. First question, why didn't he tell him where he's going? Second of all, who's Abraham? All you told us so far about Abraham is that there was a person named Terach who gave birth to Abraham, and now God reveals himself to Abraham, and cryptically enough, in the last verse of chapter 11, it says that Haran dies. Now, how did Haran die? See, the Medrash teaches us. Now, the Medrash, we need to stop for a second and understand what the Medrash is. And for the next 53 weeks, we're going to be talking about the Medrash quite a lot. And behind me, over here, there's 11 volumes of Medrash. Now, the Medrash is the Jewish oral tradition. Now, one thing we need to get straight is that religious Jews today follow the oral tradition. In fact, until Moses wrote down the 5 books of Moses, all we had was the oral tradition. In fact, furthermore, the Jews don't follow the Bible. This might come to be a surprise to many people, but we follow the tradition. In fact, even the letters of the Torah, the amount of letters in the Torah, even the written Torah, we follow tradition over historical reference. You want proof? Well, for your scholars out there, open up Tractate Shabbos in Gemara, page 55b, and have a look in what's called the Gilyon Hashas. This was a genius who wrote over there 21 examples of where there was a lost tradition of certain letters, certain words. For instance, the word totafos, which we have in everybody's tefillin. Totafos mean tefillin. Is it with a vav or without a vav? Does it have the vowel or not? Rashi says it doesn't, but it does. So that would invalidate all tefillin and all Torah in the world because it's missing a letter. But yet, we follow tradition over historical reference. You see, this is a fundamental idea about the Jewish people, that the way we understand Torah, the way we understand Bible is not historical. We don't look back for the earliest source, how the Torah was written, to understand it. What we do is we understand the accepted normalcy with the majority of observant Jews, and we follow that tradition. And the tradition we have, for instance, on Yom Kippur, that we fast, isn't really written in the Torah. All it says about Yom Kippur is v'inisem es nafshoserem. You should torture yourself. Maybe read Russian novels, but it doesn't say what to do. It says we should wear phylacteries. We should wear tefillin on our hands and our head. It doesn't say what they are. And it says that Everybody knows there's something called a mikvah, a ritual bath. It doesn't say what a ritual bath is. It says ach bar umikveh mayin yatar. It doesn't give us the details. So the Torah is not meant to be used. The Bible itself is not meant to be used and read and understood from the text itself. But it does have something that we call pshat. It has something that we call the basic understanding of the letters. And all the medrash, all the oral tradition is doing is finding a source for the oral tradition in the written words. And I'll explain. This is something astounding. And there was actually an article that I didn't see the article, but there was an article in a newspaper maybe 50 years ago that asks this question. We're all familiar with the term that Rabbi Akiva knew things that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know. Talmud tells us that. And Moshe Rabbeinu looked ahead into time and he saw Rabbi Akiva and he couldn't understand how could Rabbi Akiva know things that I don't know. You see, I got the Torah at Sinai. So how is it that Rabbi Akiva could know things that I don't know? And this advertisement in the newspaper, in the New York Times, was saying that if Rabbi Akiva knew things that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know, perhaps we know things that Rabbi Akiva didn't know. And the Ur Chaim addresses the question. The Ur Chaim was a saintly rabbi. I've been by his grave. It's on Har HaMenuchos, near the old city. An astounding genius and Kabbalist. And he explains the following understanding. He says that the oral tradition was given to us at Mount Sinai. We were given the laws of kashrut. We were given the laws of not eating milk and meat. We were given the laws of what a mikvah looks like, what the ritual bath looks like. We were given the laws of Shabbat, but we were not told how to match the oral tradition with the written word. That wasn't given to us. Rabbi Akiva figured out on his own, the source for the oral tradition in the written book of the Torah. And furthermore, the Ur Chaim explains that all of the Gemara, all of the Talmud is to teach us one thing, generally. I mean, there's a lot, but when we're looking for questions, what we're looking for is a source for what we already know what to do. And if we can't find the source in the written words, if we can't extrapolate from an extra vowel or for the shape of a word or for the order of a word, then we don't know, but we'll just say, Ella halacha leMoshe miSinai. We'll just say it's part of the oral tradition from Moses. And many times we do this. For instance, in Tractate Sukkah, discussing the festival where we build a hut outside, and the Talmud asks, how do we know the minimal height? And we say we learn it out. Finally, after several pages of trying to extrapolate it from many places, it says, Ella halacha leMoshe miSinai. It's an oral tradition. So the Midrash itself, we're on a little bit of a tangent, and we're going to get a little more tangent in a second, is understanding the oral tradition of how these stories happen. You see, when God told Moses to write the Torah, he was telling him to write something which until then, the Torah existed even before it was in words. But he somehow was able to take all this information and encode it in letters. And the Torah is an encoding of God's name. In fact, if you take from the first letter of the Torah in Hebrew until the final letter, that's God's name. The Torah is God revealing his personality, if we want to call it that. I mean, we shouldn't really say that, but it's God expressing his way of showing us in a way that's palatable to us. So when we tell the story of Abraham, we're not talking about a person. We're talking about God revealing himself through these stories. God is explaining to us something deep, something that's happening over here. So when we discuss Medrash, we're really discussing the backstory, kind of like what really went down and didn't fit in to the actual words of the Torah. But still, when we look at the Torah, we have to understand is that many times the things that are said in the Torah without the punctuation, for instance, the entire Bible was written in Hebrew. The Torah was written in Hebrew. And Hebrew, if you ever look at a Hebrew Bible, if you ever open up a Torah scroll, it has no vowels. So, for instance, when it says, lo tignov, do not steal, if we would have a comma after the word lo, it would be reading lo, no, tignov, steal. Like, the kids, when we were younger, we would go to the beach, and we once went to the beach and there was a sign that said no swimming. And my friend said to me, you don't know how to read the sign. It says no swimming allowed. So really, without punctuation, the Torah is actually meaningless. We don't have the break of words. We don't even have breaks of sentences in the Torah. In fact, even the spaces between paragraphs in the Torah are part of the oral tradition. The meaning of the words, how many letters in every word, are all part of the oral tradition. So once we've established that the oral tradition always trumps the written Torah, it's the essence of what we do. When we have a question about what something is, we don't open the Torah to figure out what to do. Now, with the book of Genesis, unlike the books which have commandments in them, which we follow for all generation, although there are some minimal commandments within the book of Genesis that are extrapolated from it, still in all, the book of Genesis would seem to be stories, but what we're explaining is that the book of Genesis is actually a revelation for us to understand certain concepts and certain ways of God, the way God behaves, the way God could be understood in our eyes, in our times, every day throughout our lives for all generations. So let's now try to go back to the Medrash once we've given the introduction of what the Medrash is, and we'll try to understand and unpack what the story of Abraham was, how Abraham became the person who God told him to leave his land. So the story is like this. There's a person named Nimrod, and Nimrod rules the world. He's the king. He's got all the money, and he considers himself, his ego got to his head, and he considers himself God. And he decides that everybody needs to bow to him. And he had wise men in his community, in his people who he listened to, who told him that Terach's son, Abraham, who was just born, this baby, is going to one day wake up and start spreading monotheism in the world. Now, I don't know exactly how they figured this out, but Nimrod calls Terach in and says, Terach, we need your son. And Terach says, yeah, give me 3 days. 3 days later, he shows up with a different baby, and Nimrod unfortunately kills this baby. And the whole incident is forgotten. In the meantime, Abraham grows up, and the Medrash says in Medrash Rabbah that until the age 48, Abraham served idols. He tried every type of idol in the world, every religion or whatever religions were at that time. He tried everything. And at age 48, he decides there's one God in the world, and he begins a mission of going around and spreading the word of God. He takes tents, he becomes wealthy, he takes tents, and he starts telling people to follow God. And he starts teaching people about one God in the world. And what happens is that Terach, who is Abraham's father, who's an idol worshiper, in fact, he is the largest manufacturer of idols in the warehouse, in the whole area. He has a warehouse filled with idols, huge, huge place filled with idols. And when one day, he tells Abraham, come here, I want you to watch all my idols. And Abraham goes, and when he was younger, he brought them food, and he noticed that they don't eat the food. So he takes a hammer, and he smashes the entire inventory, and he puts the hammer in one of the idols, the biggest one's hand. And his father comes back and says, what did you do? You're crazy. He says, I did it? He says, you don't understand. I gave this guy, this idol, food, and the other idol was jealous, and they started fighting. And before you know it, everybody killed everybody. And Terach, the father, says, what are you, crazy? He says, you know, they can't do anything. So Avram says, well, so why do you worship them? Terach gets upset. He runs to Nimrod and he tells Nimrod, remember when I told you that the baby I gave you was my son? He says, that really wasn't what happened. He says, I was deceived. And really, Abraham is alive and he's spreading monotheism and he's denying who you are. Now, Nimrod gets very upset and he decides to gather a huge army to go capture Avram. And what does Avram do? Avram decides he's going to Bavel. He's going to meet Nimrod face to face. And he gets to the city where Nimrod is. And this is where it gets interesting. So not only did Avram not hide, he went to the city where Nimrod was. And Nimrod was upset because he heard about Avram and he wanted to capture him. And Avram starts going through the city and he starts announcing and he starts teaching people. He's screaming in the streets, God is one. God created the universe. And you should only worship God and not worship Nimrod. Eventually, Nimrod captures Avraham and puts him in jail. He doesn't know what to do. So he speaks to his wise men and they decide they're going to make a party. For 7 days, they drink and are merry. And on the seventh day, they call Abraham in and they say, Abraham, come out of jail. Abraham comes up into the palace and he walks into the room where Nimrod is and he starts taunting him. He grabs his chair and he starts shaking his chair and says, Nimrod, you're not God. Let's see if you can make the sun rise in the west instead of the east. Let's see if you could change nature. Do you have that power? And he starts screaming at Nimrod and telling him that God created the universe. And he speaks in such a voice, and God's voice spoke through him, that Nimrod and all the people around him, Rabbi Yaakov Kuli writes, were stuck for 2 hours. They couldn't move. Eventually, Nimrod looks up at him and says, I must admit, God does exist. I am not God. And he lets Abraham go. But after a few days, the party continues, and Avram starts gathering crowds of people. People start following Avram and start believing in one God, start praying to God. And Avram starts schools very quickly teaching about God. An old man who's looking at a store to go buy an idol. Abraham approaches him and tells him, why are you buying an idol? He says, well, my old idol was stolen. So Abraham says, well, if your old idol was stolen, then he can't even protect himself. Eventually, Nimrod gets his energy back and he goes and he calls his wise men and says, what should we do with Abraham? So Nimrod captures Avram and he devises a plan to burn Avram at the stake. And not only will they burn him, what they decided to do was he calls Terach and he says to Terach, I know you lied to me that you didn't actually give me your son, but I want to know who gave you this advice. And he says, well, it was my other son, Haran. Actually, that's Sarah's mother and Lot's mother. And he said, Haran is the one who gave me the idea. So Nimrod takes Haran and Avram and locks them up. They start announcing in the city and all the kingdom that everybody should come with wood. And for 40 days and 40 nights, they start this fire that gets so intense that nobody could get close. And Nimrod calls to the gatekeeper and says, I want you to go down to the jail and pull Avram out and bring him so we could burn him at the stake. He comes to the cell, and amazingly, Avram's in good health, although he's been given barely any food. He's been hostage by them. And Avram starts talking to him. And Avram says, listen, why are you burning me at the stake? So he says, well, we believe in Nimrod. And within a very short time, Avram convinced the jailer to convert to Judaism or to convert to the Abrahamic religion of that time. It's a question whether Abraham was a Jew or not. But in the biblical sense, he converted him to monotheism. And when Nimrod heard about this, he sent his best soldiers down there. And one by one, within a very short time, Avram had a following of people sitting with him in the jail cell over there, and he was teaching them Torah. When Nimrod heard about this, he was furious. And eventually, they captured Avram. He took the most wicked men among him. They capture Avram and Haran. They tie them up, and they couldn't get close to this fire. This fire was huge, and the entire city was so hot that nobody could get near the city. And they devised something that they could throw Avram into the furnace, into the flames. And eventually, this entire kingdom stands around and they witness Avram. First, they take Avram and they put him on the slingshot and they toss him into the flames. Nimrod's people tell him, "You're not going to believe what's happening. Avram is just walking around inside of the furnace. He's not being burnt in Ur Kasdim. Nothing's happening." And Haran, which was, the father of Sarah and Lot, is standing there, and Nimrod says to Haran, "Whose side are you in? Are you on my side? Are you on Abraham's side? Do you believe that I'm God, or do you believe that Abraham's God?" And Haran, up until this point, was undecided. But once he saw that Abraham was walking around live in the fire, he decided, "I'm with Abraham." And this shows that Haran wasn't 100%. Maybe his outsides were good, but something was inside of him didn't really, he lacked some faith that Abraham had. And they threw him into the fire as well. What happens is Nimrod can't believe that they're alive until he comes, sees it with his very eyes. And they want to pull Abraham out of the fire, but nobody could get close enough to pull him out. The Medrash tells us that 8 people died trying to get Avram out of the flames. They couldn't do it. So eventually what Nimrod needs to do to save face, because the entire city is gathered around watching this event, he calls out and he says, "Avram, I want you to come out." And Avram says, "I'm fine in here." And Nimrod says, "I believe in your God. In the name of God of Abraham, come out and bear witness that I admit that I am not God and that your God is correct." And Avram comes out of the fire. Immediately, Nimrod bows down to Avram. The entire city bows down to Avram. And Nimrod stands up and he says to Avram, "My son, I'm giving to you to be your slave." This slave, his name is Eliezer. Eliezer Eved Avram. And furthermore, Avram takes Eliezer and Nimrod gives him tons of gifts, fills him up with kesef v'zahav and gives him gold and silver. And Avram goes on his way. After a short period of time, Nimrod has a dream. And in his dream, he sees that Avram is going to come back and haunt him. And he begins to devise a plan. His faith in the God of Abraham wasn't real. And he falls back to his original ways. And he starts a process of chasing down Avram. Terach gets word of this, Avram's father, and he says, "Avram, let's do something smart. Let's go to Eretz Canaan." And that's the final verses of chapter 11, where it says that Terach takes Avram, and he takes Eliezer, the servant, and V'nefesh asher asu b'charan, and he takes all the converts with him, and they go towards Eretz Canaan. They want to come to Eretz Yisrael, because Nimrod didn't have any jurisdiction over the land of Eretz Yisrael, over Canaan. And that is how chapter 12 begins, where God reveals himself to Abram and says, "Lech lecha me'artzecha u'me'meladcha u'beis avicha." Leave your father's house. And the question really begs itself. If Abraham and Terach, his father, and Sarah and Haran was killed. But he goes with Lot, and he goes with Eliezer, and he goes with all the converts, and all the Bnei Noach, and they start traveling towards Canaan. Why is God telling him to travel? And why didn't God understand that he's already going there? And here I want to share with you some beautiful words of the Sfas Emes. If you've listened until now, I want to add another thing. First of all, please subscribe to my channel. 95% of my viewers aren't subscribed, and this past month we had 100,000 views, which means that this channel should be much bigger and we should be spreading Torah to more people. I get messages from people all around the world, from the furthest places, who listen to Torah and are learning Torah and are strengthening through these messages. But Avram and Terach are on their way to Eretz Yisrael. So why, says the Sfas Emes, does God need to tell him? And Sfas Emes says that every person on this world has something happening to them all the time. There's always a voice saying, Lech lecha me'artzecha. There's always a voice telling people to go out of what your comfort zone is. Leave your father's house. Leave your city. Try to establish something different. But why didn't he tell him where he's going, says the Sfas Emes? The Sfas Emes says that the whole concept of Eretz Yisrael, the whole concept of the land of Israel, is going with God, traveling because God told us to, and having full trust in God. Had God told Abraham that you're going to Eretz Yisrael, you're going to the land, that would completely separate him from the purpose of the mission. The purpose of the mission was to go with God. You see, Abraham had 10 trials. The final one was God seemingly asking him to bring his son up as an offering. It didn't happen. But after God promises him so many things in this week's Parsha, so many things in Genesis 12 and 13, so many stories, hopefully we will have several more videos discussing what it means from the river to the sea that God told Abraham, that he promised them that L'zaracha, for your children, I will give this nation. And he says, I'll bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. The story of Sarah, that she was barren and had no children, why that was a blessing. Like Isaiah says, Rani akaro yalada. Sing praise to the Lord that you didn't give birth yet, and wait until Abraham is given the commandment for circumcision. And the famine that's in the land of Israel, why there was a famine, why they went to Egypt, we'll discuss all these things. Because this chapters of Genesis is the heart and soul of the message of the Jewish people and the message of God about the destiny of the Jewish people. We will be a great nation, and those who bless us will be blessed, and those who curse us will be cursed. That we will have this amazing opportunity to be able to serve God with complete and absolute faith. Now, the question remains, why didn't God tell the story of the furnace? Why only the Medrash telling us this story? The answer, my friends, is this is exactly the point. The point of telling us that God just told Avram to go and not telling us the story, the backstory of why, is precisely the faith that God asks from us. And it's a good question why God didn't tell us the story of Ur Kasdim specifically in the Torah. It's only hinted at. You see, being able to jump in a furnace doesn't create Avram Avinu. I mean, just being able to do one simple act is not enough. That's what the Mishnah in Avos, Perek Hey, the 5th chapter, the first, second, and third Mishnah are explaining. They're explaining there's a process of 10 like the fingers. 10 is the completion of a unit. When we have 10 generations from Adam to Noach, we have 10 generations from Noach to Avram, and Avram had 10 trials where God wanted to test him. God didn't test Noach. Noach wasn't ready to be tested. He wasn't going around spreading Torah and convincing people to join him. He only had his family in the Teva, like the Zohar says. But Avram, the Torah said, the story of jumping in a furnace or being thrown into a furnace because of your belief, while it's amazing, and millions of Jews were burnt in a furnace, but that itself doesn't create the father of Judaism. The father of Judaism needs to live by the Torah and needs to be able to show his faith through his trials in his life. And just like Abraham, who had his trials, which were designed specifically to create the father of the Jewish people, all our trials in our lives are specifically designed for us individually. God tailor-made every person's troubles, every person's difficulties in their life, in the macro and the micro, on the day-to-day little problems and the big problems, are exactly what God seems fit for that person to be able to grow closer to Hashem. Let's go back to the topic. When he wants to give Abraham a promise, he tells Abraham, your children will be slaved, will be going to Egypt, they'll be enslaved. And then afterwards they'll come out with the Torah. They will get the Torah at Mount Sinai. From Abraham, from his journey into Eretz Canaan, where he started to go on his own accord because he was running away from Nimrod, but he ended up going because God told him to go. And when God told him to go, God didn't tell him where he's going. And he went into the land and he traveled, but there was a famine and he had to go to Egypt. And he went to Egypt and they grabbed Sarah, his wife, and Pharaoh tried to take Sarah from Abraham. And what does God do? God punishes Pharaoh. And Pharaoh finds out that it's his wife and asks, why did you say it was your sister? And then he gives him lots of good, lots of money and silver, and sends Avram back to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Does this sound familiar? Pharaoh sending the Jews out of his land to go to Eretz Yisrael, to go to Israel? You see, all these mini stories have a message, replica of the story of the Jewish people. Everything that happened to our fathers happened to the Jewish people. Avram meets a king. There's a war with 4 kings. And Abraham goes to war. And there's someone named Malki Tzedek Melech Shalom. And we know that this was the first mention of Yerushalayim. And this secret of Yerushalayim was hidden until King David did accounting, and the angel of death stood over Yerushalayim, and God revealed to David where the place of the temple will be. But the promise that he said to Avram, and Avram said, Baruch, blessed be. In this verse, it says, Asher Yitzeischem Ur Kasdim. Avram hints at the story of the furnace. He says, you took me out of the furnace. And then he makes a covenant with him called Bris Ben Abisarim, where he cuts up the meat and he stands between it. And he promised, L'zarecha nasati es ha'aretz hazois minahar Mitzrayim ad nahar agodol nahar pras. I've given you from the river to the sea. I've given you this land. It will be yours and your children's ad olam forever. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I read all the comments, and please look out for future videos on this week's portion called Lech Lecha. We're going to discuss it in depth. There's so much here. I wish I have the time. God should grant me the time that I'll be able to put out more videos on this week's Parsha, on this week's portion, because there's so much here. It's a world of Judaism hidden in these letters. Thank you for listening. From Israel, from Eretz Yisrael, Shalom. Thank you.